We continue to hear from James, his account of the Jerusalem Council. In the gap of conversation, Simon's wife came into the dining room with a plate of cheeses and raisins and olives. She saw how little soup had been consumed, said nothing to break our silence, but withdrew, taking with her the plate still full. At length, John spoke. He had pulled an oil lamp to himself and was cupping the flame between his hands. Firelight played upward on his face. After the clamorous exchange, the man seemed subdued. Well, and of course he would seem so. His first words gave good reason and laid caution to my own tongue. He said, 4 years ago, my brother was executed outside the walls of this city. I am weak. I should not grieve his death. It was what the Lord had prophesied. He said that we, my brother and I, would drink the cup that he was to drink. But I think about him every day. And this, James, is what I think. Why did Agrippa kill him? Because Agrippa was seeking support of the Jews, and he didn't see my brother as a Jew among the Jews. He saw him as something different, though we are no different. John drew breath. His nostrils distended, but his mouth was solemn. James, he said, that is the predominating problem today, both for us and for Jews in general, that Jews and Jews are divided, that we seem divided to the world, and we are divided internally. Again he breathed, gazing into the lamp flame pink through the flesh of his fingers. He seemed to be seeking the best approach to his thesis. He said, what's happening in Antioch must not affect Jerusalem, nor should it seem even related to us in Jerusalem. For as greater and greater numbers of Gentiles join the company of believers, believing Jews are seen less and less as Jews. He looked at me. Do you agree? I didn't answer. Pity for his own loss nearly forced me to utter sounds of agreement, but my growing sense of isolation among these men and a mistrust of my tongue overcame pity. We should be known as Jews, shouldn't we? John said, still looking at me, not because my brother would not have died, though purely as a Jew he would not have died, but because that is what we are. Isn't that right, James? Simon, desperate at my silence, spoke for me. Of course it's right. We are of Israel, with a message for Israel. John turned his eyes toward Simon. Then we also ought to stand with our people, especially now when they are everywhere under threat in the empire. Especially now when the favor of the emperor is so arbitrary and unstable. Now is not a time to divide and dilute the Jewish identity, John said, but rather to unify and to strengthen it. James, he said, turning his eyes to me, ever and ever to me, you are right. The covenant law has saved us alive for ages and ages, and the covenant law must still do so today. Then let us purify covenant law and make firm our Jewish adherence. By the same token, now is not the time to blur the Jewish face before the world. He paused. He returned his gaze to the lamp flame, again breathing, gathering his thoughts. John has enormous eyes. His manner is ruminative. If you interrupt his talk, you lose his talk. He falls silent. While his brother was alive, John was mostly silent. Now, in a voice barely audible, he began to ask a series of questions. What happened to Israel in Alexandria 10 years ago? Barnabas said softly, pogrom. Simon said, synagogues, burned to the ground, mothers and their children murdered, fathers and husbands. It was more than a pogrom, Barnabas. It was a massacre. And the survivors were packed like cattle into ghettos. John's eyes glistened. The lamp flame showed in his tears. John of mortal sympathies. And what then? He asked of the fire. 8 years ago, the emperor wanted to put a statue of himself in the Holy of Holies in the temple. The abomination of desolation was coming again. Saul, perhaps you heard the howls of the Jews in those days. For 6 months we trembled in anguish here, praying, planning for war, committing our bodies to death when that statue should actually come. No, the emperor changed his mind and changed it back, and we were saved from horrors only by his assassination. That was Caligula. Now we've got Claudius. And the whims of this one are no better than the whims of that. Jews, John said, raising his gaze, must seem to be, and Jews must be, a visible blood unity everywhere in the purview of this present Emperor Claudius. Saul, he said. Barnabas, he said. Do you know what happened this year here at the Passover? Barnabas, gazing at his own hands now, said, we heard that people died under the feet of other people, running. Yes, said John. Did you hear a figure? Do you know how many people died? No, said Barnabas. John said, Peter does. How many people died here, Peter? Simon responded to this catechesis, also in a lowly voice and in a complete sentence. 20,000 pilgrims died. Do you know why? John asked. Do you know what created such a terrible stampede of humanity that 20,000 people should perish at the feast of the Passover? No, said Simon. James does. John closed his mouth a moment. The trembling, wet fire in his eyes had caused the water to rise in mine. John said, James, why don't you tell them what caused the stampede? Show them the reason for Jewish solidarity in the Roman world. I said, the governor had stationed a regiment in the temple courts to forestall rioting at the feast. It's not an unusual precaution. But this year, one soldier, a pagan, uncircumcised, dropped his breeches and exposed himself. I paused inside. The pilgrims were stunned at the blasphemy. They cried out with such rage that the governor thought a riot had begun. So he ordered the entire army to swarm the Temple Mount. Our people fled in terror, and in the narrow streets of Jerusalem, Jews trampled Jews to death. The circumcised trampled the circumcised to death, while the uncircumcised laughed us to scorn. John's eyes were lost in the flame again. He breathed quietly, then he said, and now comes the news from Rome, that Claudius is closing synagogues. Roman religion is renewed. Rome detests the superstition of the Jews. And the emperor, I hear, is threatening to expel the Jews because of conflict among our people, because of antagonisms made shamefully public. Antagonisms, so I hear, over Jesus. Lord, help us. We are inviting the ire of earthly powers. John said, it doesn't matter to Claudius whether some follow Jesus and others do not. Before Rome, Jews are Jews. Again, he turned his face to me. The rim of his cheek and jaw glowed orange from the single lamp flame. His eye receded into shadow. He said, but Rome perceives a difference between Gentiles and Jews, And a Gentile is a Gentile, whether he's circumcised or not. In the eyes of God, there is surely a distinction. Surely, James, but not in the eyes of Claudius. For the sake of the nation and of the faith, he must not see Jews fighting other Jews, must not see Jews fighting over Jesus. On the other hand, neither must he lose sight of Israel among all the peoples, or we will lose place and privilege in the empire. But I believe that the more Gentiles he sees inmixed with Israel, the less he will see Israel at all. James, John said, don't you agree? I nodded. With a genuine mercy for me, and with affection, which is most destructive of my reserve and my self-control, John placed his hand beside mine on the table and continued, then you know, don't you? For our sake, for the sake of believers, and for the sake of Jews everywhere, we must let Gentiles both seem to be and be Gentiles, exactly as Saul has requested. Now is the time to refine our name, our nation, and our face in the world, not to undefine it. There is but one God and one Lord, and one Jesus and one Messiah for us all. That is the union all believers have together, whether Jew or Gentile. Nonetheless, before a world that does not know the Spirit of the Lord, we faithful will appear divided. We can't change that, but we can turn it to our benefit. Saul, my brother, John said, straightening his neck with a formality of his own. He had arrived at his thesis. Yes, go forth with your gospel to the Gentiles, he said. Go freely, unhindered and unrestrained. Establish churches separate from the synagogues. Likewise, we will keep preaching Jesus in the synagogues to the Jews. James, my brother, he said to me, when the crisis and the collapsing comes, and how can they not come in this world, the divisions of the flesh would divide our people altogether. Jews would not trust Gentiles, even the circumcised Gentile, to sacrifice their lives for the temple and for the law. Suspicions and internal enmities would aid our enemies and defeat the chosen people. John stopped. He had run out of words. He touched the back of my hand without looking at me, then took his own hand back again. No one spoke. Barnabas had put his head down, laying his brow in the bend of his elbow. Saul was tapping the index finger of his right hand against his temple. I could not read the man's expression, though he must have recognized the effect of John's logic. The way was clear before him now. I would not dispute this final appeal, for I loved the temple with all my heart, and I loved my people, the Jews. I rose from the table and walked out to the tiny kitchen where Simon's wife was sitting alone in the dark, her hand upon her mouth, her cheeses uneaten beside her. Miriam, I said, please bring us some wine. We're nearly done. She said, is it well with us? I paused and said, it will be well, and then returned to the dining room. No one had moved. I don't think anyone had spoken in my absence. I approached Saul and Barnabas from behind, extending my hand to both of them. Saul rose, clasped my right hand in his right hand, smiling. Barnabas, gently for a big man, reached and took the fingers of my left hand in his right. I said, it is done. Tomorrow we'll speak to the whole assembly and assure them that as Simon was giving good news for the Jews, so you will have been giving good news for the Gentiles. We'll stop there.